is the left ventricle the one that pumps to the rest of the body. And normally the pulmonary pressure is very low, it's about 10 or 15 millimeters of mercury. The systemic pressure, and I'm sure that you have all heard 120/80, that means 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury if it's a normal type of blood pressure. The problem is, therefore, is that 80% to 90% of all of the pumping work of the heart is done through the left ventricle. And as a result of that, 80 to 85% of heart failure is due to failure of the left ventricle. Okay, well, so way back in the 1980s, Dr. Adrian Kentrowitz, who, by the way, his son is here in Miami, he's a cardiologist, developed what is called an intra-aortic balloon pump. And essentially what it was is that this pump in here was implanted surgically on the descending part of the aorta. And when it was inflated, it would take all the blood that was in between the balloon and the outside of in the inner part of the descending aorta and assist the heart in its pumping function. So the very highfalutin word, it is hemodynamics stabilization of the heart, because the intra-aortic balloon pump, when the left ventricle was relaxing, the pump would actually inflate and it would send out blood, the blood that was in between here, at higher pressures. So it was assisting the heart. The problem with the intra-aortic balloon pump, and by the way, it's still being used, is that you can only use it in a patient for about a day or two. Then after that, it doesn't work anymore. So we had to come up with something else. Well, so what we decided was to use an artificial heart, which is here. The animal that we had to use was a calf. And the reason for a calf is that a calf starts at about 70 kilograms in weight, and the cardiac output of a calf is identical to the cardiac output of you and me. And when we started on the artificial heart program, we actually were using a nuclear engine. The nuclear engine was going to be implanted together with the heart, because if we could use a nuclear engine, it was going to last 25 years, so you didn't have to do anything. However, there was a problem, and I have to tell you a quick story. We had already developed the nuclear engine, the implantable nuclear engine. We had the artificial heart ready, and we were at the National Institutes of Health on the last day before we would apply for FDA approval. It was an entire day and everybody was there. And I remember as if it was today, this was in the mid-70s. There was this very thin lady. She came in at 8:30. We were supposed to be done by 4 o'clock so everybody can go out to the airport and get their flights. She was very thin, very quiet, didn't do anything. It had this hat with one single little feather on top of it. It looked like an Indian chief. And at 4:05, when we were going to stop the lecturing, she got up, went over to the front, and she says, "My name is such and such. I am in the nuclear department of some university, and I have done a back of the envelope calculation. And my back of the envelope calculation, since you guys are using plutonium, let me tell you, if a organization knows of at least 15 patients who have received an implantable nuclear engine using plutonium, if they were to hijack 12 patients, now they have enough plutonium to make an atomic bomb. And it will be inside of the United States. And that absolutely killed the nuclear engine, and we had to go into something else." Well, so the way we did it is that the nuclear engine was done. This is how it was going to be done. And we said that there's absolutely no way that we can assure the fact that a organization, a bad organization, was going to hijack people, and there was going to be an atomic bomb inside of the United States. So we went pneumatic. We went with air. And the way that the left ventricular assist device was going to work is that the inlet, it was going to go into the left ventricle. The pump was going to be sucking, helping the heart. Going into this section right over here, there was a one-way valve here, one-way valve there, so that the blood had to go in one direction, and then this part in here was going to be attached or anastomosed to the descending aorta. And so this was an axisymmetric pump, and it was going to counteract the heart or counterpulsate with the heart. When the left ventricle was in systole, the artificial heart was in diastole, and vice versa. When the left ventricle was in diastole, then the artificial heart was in systole, and we could do 6.8 liters a minute. This is more than enough to maintain somebody alive and walking and doing things until a heart transplant became available. Now, we knew that there were, going in, we knew that there were going to be a few things that we had to worry about. One was bleeding, and we had a very good idea as to how to do it. Thrombosis, part of my reason for being in the artificial heart is that I had come up with a method, theoretical method of allowing the blood not to thrombose without having to use anticoagulants. We knew there was going to be an infection. We thought that we were going to be good enough so that there was going to be very little hemolysis, that is to say, destroying the blood cells. And we knew that patients were going to be in hypertension, and some of them going to be in hypotension. We had no idea how complicated this thing was going to be. We thought it was going to take anywhere from 2 to 4 years to develop the artificial heart. Let me tell you, it took 22 years to do. And we rewrote the books of medicine. One of the things that we were doing is, in order to make the internal surfaces of the artificial heart as blood compatible as possible, we came up with a method of having a living lining that was going to come directly from the patient. This is something that had never been done before, so that we wouldn't have to anticoagulate the patient. And this was the paper that we put out together with the Heart Institute in Texas, because nobody believed what we were doing. We actually came up with a method of developing a living lining inside of the artificial heart so we wouldn't have to use an anticoagulant. And this is a picture of the inside. We called it a controlled thrombus. What you see in here is fibrin at the very beginning, and these little tiny little red round things that you see here are platelets, and these are white blood cells. And after a certain period of time, everything stabilized. And again, you can see all of these little platelets in here, and red blood cells and white blood cells, but no thrombosis. We controlled the thrombosis, and this is how we were able to make a living artificial heart from totally synthetic materials. Now, this is a famous picture that nobody could believe. The lining that we made is from here to here and there. This is a monocyte, a circulating monocyte. This particular picture shows that this monocyte is penetrating into the lining, because what we found, and nobody could believe it, is that the monocyte will transform itself into a smooth muscle cell. The smooth muscle cell makes collagen. Collagen is what you and I have in our normal arteries and veins. And when we showed this picture, after many years of research, we saw that this cell, which actually came in from the circulating blood, was actually making collagen. All of these little fibers that you see in here is collagen at high magnification. So we created a living blood vessel inside of the artificial heart. We call that a pseudo intimal lining because we were controlling the thrombus, or the possibility of the blood coagulating onto the artificial heart. And this, we found that there were these monocytes that would penetrate the initial lining. The monocytes then became transformed into smooth muscle cells. Your arteries and mine are lined with smooth muscle cells and endothelial cells. And then some of the endothelial cells, that we call them pseudo-endothelial cells, made one of the biochemicals that you and I use, called factor VIII. So synthetically, we were able to make endothelial cells that we call pseudo-endothelial cells, and they were making factor VIII, which is something that we need in order to make sure that there is no blood coagulation. And so we ended up with a stable lining, and this is what caused the artificial heart to work. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. Well, afterwards, we actually went from a pneumatic heart to an electric heart. This is a heart that is currently being used. So I think that one of the things that I would like to tell everybody today is that, you know, since we have had for the past two and a half months, all of the mishigas, you know, with the COVID-19, well, here is a medical development with a happy ending. We are treating people in heart failure with the artificial heart. In this case, it's electric. Here's the artificial heart. In this case, what we're doing is that we're actually going into the abdominal cavity. Here's the heart. The inlet to the artificial heart is from the left ventricle. The heart pumps. The blood comes in here into, in this case, is the ascending aorta, the ascending arch of the aorta. And as you can see here, this is a rechargeable battery. The patient recharges the batteries once a day, and it keeps it going for throughout the entire day, even though they may be using activity that you and I would be doing without even thinking about it. And if an artificial heart patient has their shirt on or their clothes on, you and I wouldn't even know that they have an artificial heart. And they could be walking out in the street, they could be working, they could be out in a shopping center. You and I wouldn't know that they have an artificial heart in them. Well, with the texture surfaces, this is how we ended up with the living lining. And this is what the inside of the blood of the artificial heart looks like. This is the polyurethane that the rabbi talked to you about. And this is metal. We came up with these microspheres so that we end up with a lining both here, and it's a living lining. Okay, now here is a patient, an actual patient. What we did is that even though the patient is standing, you can see the battery here. This is the rechargeable part of the battery, so that you can take that out. We, by Photoshop, we took this patient and we put the heart in here, and because on the normal conditions, you wouldn't even know that this patient has it. And one last thing, because this is the last slide, and then we can open it up for Q&A. When we first started on the artificial heart or the left ventricular assist device, it was called bridge to transplantation. That is to say, the idea is that we would stabilize a patient in heart failure. We would be assisting the patient's left ventricle, and the patient would be alive. We would maintain the patient alive for as many weeks or as many months as it was necessary until a heart transplant became available. This is what was called bridge to transplantation. We have now changed that to destination therapy. Let me tell you what that's all about. Remember that I was saying to you that we rewrote the books of medicine? Well, one of the things that we found after years of having patients waiting for a heart transplant, we found that the natural heart was recovering. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. The heart was recovering. And so after several weeks, depending upon the patient, we could actually remove the artificial heart. The patient would be on his own heart as if nothing had happened. Well, nobody could understand it. Well, we understand it now. We now know that the heart has these magical cells called cardiac stem cells. And the stem cells actually repair the heart. And so after a certain period of time, we can remove the artificial heart and the patient does not need a transplant. That is what is now called destination therapy. And essentially, this is the last slide that I wanted to show you. I'm going to get out of the share mode so I can see everybody. And essentially, that's the story. Thank you very much.
So, Doctor, thank you. But I actually have two questions. One, does the artificial heart compensate for exertion?
Yes, it does. We can either pump 4 liters per minute in case that you're sitting down or laying down. Let's say that you start exerting, let's say you start walking and running and doing things. We can go up to 8 liters per minute. Right now, since you're sitting down and I know your height and I know your weight, you're now pumping approximately 6 liters a minute. If you were to be running, you would be doing about 8, 8.5. Yes, we can do it. We can bring it up to 8.5.
And does that have to be like manually? Does the person himself have to turn a dial?
Great question. The answer is no. The internal, in the artificial heart, we have a whole series of electronics. The electronics do several things. First of all, it is looking at what your own heart is doing, and it follows your heart on a beat by beat basis. The other thing that it does is that through telemetry, it is sending signals out to the hospital so that we can watch and see how your heart is doing on a beat by beat basis, 24 hours a day.
So one of the benefits of being the host and the rabbi is I can control the room. So I actually only have one more question. So if they're cardiac stem cells, they actually repair the damaged heart after 4 or 5 weeks, then there should be no need for heart transplants anymore, because everyone should just get this artificial heart, and 5 or 6 weeks later, the stem cells have repaired whatever damage there was to the heart. Is that accurate?
That is accurate in about 95% of the cases. In 5% of cases, the hypertension that the patient has had has been so great for such a long period of time that their heart has become too large. It is called cardiomegaly. And so even though the infarcted part of the heart is now actually pumping, the heart cannot keep you alive correctly because it is too large for the size of your chest. So that happens in about 5% of the cases.
Very good. So if everyone would look at the bottom of their screen, there's an option to raise your hand. I know that there are 30 people in the room, which is fantastic. Either you could look, if you have a question, if you'd like to answer. If you don't find that option to raise your hand, it's an electronic hand. Just wave at me and I'll do my best to see you so I can. Okay, Myrna, you're the first one, Myrna.
Oh, thank you, because I have to leave you. So I'm really honored to be able to ask this. I live in Danvers, and years ago, I did a story on the people at Abiomed with their first artificial heart, which was cumbersome and outside the body. And frankly, I'm just floored that all of this has happened within a relatively short period of time. So are we to say now that this is really perfected? And if so, when I hear anything that's electronic, I worry about outside interference, some sort of an electric shock or lightning or something else. Can something interfere with this?
Okay, the answer is generally speaking, no. The only thing is that if somebody has an internal, because everything that is now done is internal, so
right.
that you walk around and you do things. The only time that we're worried about electrical interference is that if you are in a airport and you have to go through the security thing, this is why they ask you, do you have a pacemaker? Do you have a, no, they don't say an artificial heart, they say a pacemaker. If you have a pacemaker or an artificial heart, you go around it because the machine can interfere with the implantable electronics. So that's a great question.
Very good. Thank you, Myrna. Any other questions? Yes, I think it's J.S. Larma.
Hey, Jordan. Yep.
Sorry.
Yes. Hi, Michael. So nice to see you. You look like you're having a wonderful place to be in Florida. So Michael and I go back a long time. So my partially true story is, so I went to the doctor and the doctor said, Jordan, don't you think you should stop exercising until you're in better shape? And I said, that's a very good question. So Michael, how do you know whether you should or shouldn't exercise? Is there some secret to, is that a dumb question?
Okay, well, there is no question that in the majority of people, whether you have a medical condition or not, you should exercise. Okay, exercise is very important because if you don't, your muscles actually begin to atrophy. So one of the things that we do with patients who get a left ventricular assist device, since we don't know whether it's going to take 2 months or 6 months until we can take the artificial heart out, we actually put them on a cardiac rehabilitation system and program so that there's no question that the rest of the body is going to be as good as the heart.
Thank you, Michael. Interesting. Yeah.
Any other questions? Loretta, there you go.
Yes. Can this system be used for children as well? Newborns that have a heart problem or children in general?
Okay, on the normal conditions, no. Because let's say, for example, that, even though physiologically we could do it, in other words, we would make a smaller heart, let's say for a kid that is 10 years old or 11 or 12 or 13. And even though we could probably do it, the problem is that the kid is growing and all of the connections that we have made between the heart and the aorta start stretching out. And there is a probability that if you stretch it out too much, that one of them fails, and then the kid is going to stop bleeding internally. So usually we start with somebody who is 18 years old and they're not growing anymore, and that is the earliest that we can do.
Even if it is only 4 or 5 weeks, because you said that in 4 or 5 weeks, the heart might get well again.
Okay, but what we have to do in medicine, and especially this type of surgery, is that we have to use worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is that you have a young kid, let's say that is 12 years old, and they're growing. And of course, you know that growth happens in spurts. Growth in a kid is not linear. So, a kid may be going for several weeks or several months or several years, and it's essentially the same height. And then all of a sudden, in 1 year or 2 years, all of a sudden, they gain X number of inches of height. What we have to do is that we have to look at worst case scenario. Let's say that this particular young patient at the age of 12 got a heart, and for whatever reason, the heart is not mending. It is not recovering. So it would take a year before that patient's heart becomes good enough so that we can remove the artificial heart. What if in the middle of that period of time, the kid has a growth spurt, and then all of a sudden, absolutely guaranteed is going to die? Because if one of those connections just opens, you're talking about 4 liters, 5 liters, 6 liters of blood going inside. There is absolutely no time to do anything at all for the patient. So generally, we use worst case scenario, and we say 18 is the absolute youngest. Interestingly enough, do you know what is the absolute oldest?
No.
95.
Wow.
Can you imagine that?
But the older ones so benefit to be old.
Oh, that is absolutely right.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So we actually have a number of screens, so I can't see everyone, but I think Sergio, go ahead.
Yes, doctor. In reference to the stem cell, it worked magnificent for the heart. Any other organs that it's viable and useful?
Okay, great question. The answer is actually here in the building where we are. And, my wife and I, are cooped up in here like everybody else in Bal Harbor. About 4 months ago, in our building, we have an adult education thing going from December and January and February. I actually gave a presentation strictly on stem cells and how I started, because of the fact that, there were so many people here who are definitely over the age of 65 or 70. I started talking about the fact that stem cells can actually be used to take away wrinkles. So dermatologists come in, and especially, let's say, in the parts of the face where we have what we call muscles of expression. So right over here, between the eyes, the nasolabial fold right over here, around the lips, they actually inject these stem cells. And believe it or not, you look 20 to 25 years younger. The other one where stem cells are being used is in the liver. And the latest one that I've heard is that it's actually being done for diabetics who have a problem with their kidneys. So these are now cells, stem cells that are being used in the kidneys. So the answer is yes, it is being used in many other places. In addition,
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, I have a few more. I'm just trying to look. If anyone has their Ahuva, I think, yes, there you are, Ahuva. I'm sorry, Ahuva, you were muted. Start again.
Transplant versus the artificial heart. If there is an opportunity to have a transplant, would you rather, or is it not even?
Okay. There's no question that heart transplants do a terrific job. And in fact, for many years, that's all we had. The downside of having a heart transplant is that the patient needs to be put on medications to prevent rejection. And so you have got to take, in many cases, 8 to 12 pills per day in order to prevent rejection of the transplanted heart. And so, if that's what you need in order to live, that's what you do. But having a choice between a left ventricular assist device that will have a good probability that your own heart will recover, and getting a heart transplant where you have the probability of rejection, you're better off with an artificial heart if that is an option for you.
Is the transplant an option for children?
Okay, and children up to a point, yes, because again, the heart transplant that you're gonna have in a child needs to be able to be put into their thoracic cavity. And it has to be a small heart. If the kid continues to grow, the heart doesn't grow. And eventually that kid is going to become so that the cardiac output of the little heart is not enough for what that particular person who is now an adult needs. And they're going to be tired and sitting down all the time because they don't have enough cardiac output to control their physiological functions.
If no one else has questions, I'm trying to see if anyone's hand is up. I have a couple Jewish law questions. First of all, when a person passes away, does the device remain inside them? or does the device have to be surgically removed upon death?
Okay, in the unlikely scenario that it happens in about 4% or so, 4 to 5% of the patients who have a heart transplant. On the normal conditions, you bury the person with the artificial heart. And by the way, since we're talking about halakha, you remember that I said that in the artificial heart, we have 2 one-way valves. Those valves are pig valves. And so a question was, when we were doing the artificial heart, let's say that you have a Jewish person who is ultra-Orthodox. Well, can you implant something that has 2 pig valves in them? Well, the religious authorities from the Chabad and the ultra-Orthodox, they got together. It took about 5 days worth of talking to them. But the answer was, yes, you can implant a device containing pig valves because you're not eating the pig, you're not getting any pleasure from it. And as a result and we're saving your life. So the answer is yes, even if you're ultra-Orthodox, you can get pig valves implanted in you.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. I remember that about 30 years ago or more, there were certain pacemakers that had a radioactive component to it. I'm not exactly sure if it was the power source or whatever. And it was when people would get that particular type of pacemaker, they had to sign a document that upon death that they would notify the appropriate people because the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, didn't want this radioactive material buried all over America and cemeteries. And the question was asked to Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, who also is a PhD from Columbia in biochemistry. And he said, absolutely, you're allowed to post humorously after death, have it surgically removed. And it doesn't have to even be done by a rabbi. It can be done by the staff at the funeral home. And as long as it is done respectfully, it doesn't matter. It is allowed to be done because, like you said, pikuach nefesh, to save a life, not only are you allowed to, again, your first rule about the pig heart is you're not eating it. And the second one, and most importantly, is pikuach nefesh. So I can tell you that there are cases hundreds of years ago where doctors would tell someone, you have to eat this and this and this, and it's not kosher. Let's say pig, you gotta eat pig. The answer is make a bracha and eat it. That's all. By the way, you would have to make a bracha. The question is, are you allowed to enjoy it? Yeah, you're allowed to enjoy it.
Yes, and Rabbi, I'm pretty sure that you know that Rabbi Dr. Tendler is one of the world's experts on medical ethics.
Yes. So I had him when I was at Yeshiva University.
Oh.
I had him not only for Talmud, but I had him for biochemistry, biology, and medical ethics. In fact, while I was there and one of his students, he disappeared for 3 days. He was neither in the Talmud class in the morning or in bioethics in the afternoon. And he came back and he told us that he was flown in a private jet to Puerto Rico to a Catholic hospital in San Juan where there were conjoined twins. And the Roman Catholic Archdiocese didn't know what to do because the baby's heart, they shared a heart, and the heart was not strong enough for them both to live. And they had to choose which baby would live and which baby would die. Yeah. And I can tell you that it was February 1979. And what happened was they called him in as a consultant because he was a Ph.D., he was a medical ethicist, and he was also a rabbi. And the amazing thing is he brought us in the x-rays. And we were able to see the x-rays. And his decision was there was a majority child and the second child was significantly smaller. And he halakhically determined that the child that was significantly smaller was not considered viable. There's a halakhic idea about that. But more importantly, like it's equivalent of a tumorous growth that is endangering the child that is viable. And he stayed actually for the surgery, and afterwards he came back and he said, the good news is the bad news. Unfortunately, both children did not survive the surgery.
Oh,
That was actually alleviating a lot of stress from those members of the ethical committee that had to make such a difficult and burdensome decision. But Michael, doctor, I just did one more question for you. I think you mentioned in one of our conversations that all of this research and development and saving of lives and creating this artificial heart that had effect on a lot of you in a religious sense. Is that accurate? Could you
oh,
share a
absolutely.
few thoughts about that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think that this is the part that, for most of your congregation that they need to hear. As we were going along, I was getting I was starting to think very much about if what we're looking here is so incredibly complicated. Could this be what regular science now says? Is that rather than that, essentially life began and it started getting more and more complicated strictly on the basis of random chance. This is so incredibly complicated that if you know anything about statistics and probability, the probability of a human being evolving from a single cell is 1 to the 150th power. It cannot happen. So I was saying to myself, there has to be something behind here. It cannot just happen as a result of random chance. There had to be a design. And I didn't tell anybody because I thought that as a scientist, since the artificial heart was completely secular, I didn't want to tell anybody that all of a sudden, I was thinking about God. Well, it came as an incredible surprise to me that as I was talking to other people, especially when we were having a cup of coffee or we were sitting down without talking about patience and science, that they too were thinking about that this is something that is so complicated that it could not have come as a result of just chance. And believe it or not, even though, in the artificial heart program, we were in Boston, there was another one at the Cleveland Clinic, another institution that was being funded by the National Institutes of Health. There was another one in San Francisco, so there were several groups. Amazingly enough, even though at that time, and I'm talking about the late 70s and early 80s, the population of Jews in the United States was probably about 3%. That now is probably 2, maybe less than 2. But let's say 3% population of Jews in the United States. Jewish doctors were overrepresented in the artificial heart program. 25% of the cardiologists, surgeons, biostatisticians were Jewish. 25%. Well, as it turned out, after everything was said and done and we went around asking everybody, nearly 45% of people who were involved in the artificial heart became very religious. And I was amazed. And not only were we had Christians, we had Roman Catholics, we had Protestants. There was one surgeon, a fantastic surgeon from Japan, who was into something called Shintoism. He became very religious. So it was amazing that starting out with something this secular, 45% of people ended up saying, science cannot explain everything. We need to go into religion to explain why we're here and what we're doing.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I know a similar story of Dr. Daniel Wunsch, who was a graduate of Yale Medical School, secular Jew, brilliant doctor, and he was doing a postdoctorate, I think it was at MIT, and getting towards a Ph.D., and he was working with a statistician a PhD in actuarial science and statistician, and they were working with infertility, human infertility. And they published a paper that there are approximately 12 different interactions for a woman to get pregnant. Forget about what a man's interactions are, but there's, I think it's 8 different hormones, like follicle stimulating hormone, gonadotropins, luteinizing hormones, pituitary growth hormones. I can't remember, I just remember reading the article and I heard him speak, and that they did the math, the statistics. And the chances of the right amount at the right time in the right sequence in the right day of the month was something like 1 in 285 million, 1 in 300 million. Not that it was just there, but it was there at the right time, at the right place, in the right amounts. And that also you had to be intimate with your spouse at the right time, because there was also a window of fertility. It was like 1 in 300. And the whole article that I heard him present was the reason why they call it the miracle of life. So I want to, let me just check to make sure, because make sure if anyone else has their hands up, if there's anyone else. I think there's a chat open, let me see. Okay, very good. And God willing, we are, it actually is being recorded. And when we start Mincha Mariv, if there are no more questions, I'll answer questions. And if you'd like to get a copy of it, I know someone by the name of Emma has requested a copy of the recording, and I'll do my best to help her get it. Roz, I see you'd like to...
Doctor, the last course he gave a few weeks ago, did we ever get the link to that? The one on the COVID?
Oh, the one that I did on COVID. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. Again, you know, the misery wasn't the host. If you're the host, you can record the Zoom session. But if you're the co-host, whoever the host is the one that has to made it available. The information that I gave on COVID was sponsored by somebody else. So unfortunately, I don't have it. I'd love to have it myself because, you know, I was the one that, you know, gave the thing. So
it was fascinating. And I told so many people about it and they go, no, that can't happen. I go, listen, I'm listening to this cardiologist who was involved in this. Don't tell me what I didn't know. I kept notes and I kept telling everybody, I'm letting you learn. You don't have to go on the TV news to watch it, you know? So it was really very, very interesting. And I thank you so much for that one.
Well, that's very nice of you. And I actually wish I had it and I could send it to you, but I don't have it.
Okay, thank you.
In fact, I don't have this one either. 2 people from, you know, my old temple in Massachusetts, they have actually asked if the rabbi is going to have a link later on so that you can go on demand and see
right.
it. I'm actually asking the rabbi if that's going to be possible for this particular session.
Right.
So I can tell you, Danny, who works in our office, runs our office, I can see how to upload the Zoom class to YouTube to share with everyone. So Danny is going to upload it. And Danny, I'm going to send you, I have only so far one request, Danny. I'm going to send it to you now. The person, her name is Emma, I believe. Danny, you have now her email address. She's the one who requests the video. Thank you, Danny, for taking care of that. If you'd like, you can contact me or the office or Danny, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of the video or the link on YouTube where you'll be able to see the presentation. We're going to be davening Mincha in 9 minutes. You're all invited to join us for Mincha Mariv. I want to again thank Dr. Michael Szycher, a beloved friend of the community, not only the South Florida community, but a leader of his community in Massachusetts. And God willing, we'll be able to refer to you in the future. I'd love to hear your intake on COVID. You know, I was really scared the first 4 weeks because 7 rabbis, 7 rabbis in Dade County were positive, all within like 10 days of each other. Like they were like falling like dominoes. And like, I'm telling you, I always daven, but I was daven with real intent for those weeks. So, and it's a concern for all of us. I know. I feel confident that we're over the bad news, we're over the various issues, and I think that we see light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that God willing, if we keep up our proper restrictions, I see the opportunity to, God willing, have a healthy, happy Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. God willing. God willing. Okay, so I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to stop the recording.